Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today's video is a little bit different than the videos that I have put together before. I am experimenting with trying to do a little bit of editing and do some voiceovers, and we will see how that works. I usually just sit down and talk and don't do any editing or like clipping of things, so I'm not very good at that part, but I thought that this would be a fun video to put together, and I spent a lot of time looking at different books and thinking of my answers, and would really love to know everybody else's answers to these questions as well. But essentially, as the title says, this is just a breakdown of my favorite fantasy books from every decade for the last 100 years. So I put this from 1920 to 2020 and divvied up all of the fantasy books in increments of 10 years and examined which books were released in a particular decade, which ones are still remembered today, had a big influence on modern fantasy as we know it right now, the ones that have kind of stood the test of time or really changed the face of fantasy, modern fantasy as we read it, during the time which they were published. So this was a really fun video to put together, a really fun video to think about, and I had an agonizing time choosing my answers for a lot of these decades. And I have not yet edited it together, but I can make the guess that it is going to be a long and painful process for me. So hopefully I will bring this video to a point that I am happy with, but regardless of how painful I find the editing process, I found the putting together of this video to be very fun. So I hope that you enjoy it. I would love to know, as you work your way through, which books do you feel like I should have included from certain decades? Because I think it goes, like, I don't really need to make this a disclaimer, but I will. I could not include every fantasy book written for each decade, or this would be a series. This would be a college course. This would not be a hopefully under 30-minute YouTube video. But if there are particularly glaring omissions that you feel like should have made the list, should be there, please let me know. I would love to know what you think the biggest influences were on fantasy in each of these decades. Which books would you select from each decade? Do you find it easy to make those selections, or was it really agonizingly difficult? I will say that as we get up into the 1980s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s, it was painful trying to pick only one book from each of those decades, but I have made the best selection for me. This is not the book that I think is the best from each decade. This is my favorite fantasy book that was published in each of these decades, and we will begin the video taking a look at the 1920s. So if we take a look at the 1920s, fantasy fiction was still in its fledgling state. A lot of the novels that were being written were still not necessarily obscure works, but works that were not getting as much literary attention as those from other genres or other areas of fiction. And there were still a lot of those fairy tale-esque stories, a lot of whimsical fairy tales, though they did start to evolve beyond stories for children and into the realm of stories for adults. And we started to get the rise of the fantasy adventure story. Some major titles that started being released in the 1920s included the Tarzan novels, the Dr. Dolittle novels, and the Wizard of Oz novels. Now, these would be series that would span many years and in some cases many decades. We also had literary fiction that kind of genre blended into fantasy with Kafka's The Trial and The Castle. And we have some works that have had a resurgence in recent years. And we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to the 1970s, because this was a decade where a lot of that fantasy resurgence did happen. But we had three major works that still tend to inspire a lot of our modern fantasy authors today, and those would be The Worm Ouroboros, The King of Elfland's Daughter, and Ludin the Mist. So those are three major works of fantasy from the 1920s that still seem to have some influence, and you can still see the resonance from those novels into the works that are still being published today. So, of the books that were outlined in the 1920s, this was the easiest choice to make, and I have to admit that I have only read one of the books that I have on this list. The only book that I have read from this selection that I gave you is Hope Merlice's Lud in the Mist, which was written in 1926, and I actually read earlier this month. Lud in the Mist is a book that was on my radar because of the influence that it had in particular on Neil Gaiman, but I also know that it was included in Jo Fletcher's collection of fantasy masterworks, a bunch of reprinted fantasy classics that she felt were the best in the genre. So I think that it does have a pretty solid critical reputation as well. It was part of the big resurgence of fantasy books that were republished in the 1970s. A lot of those older works of fantasy that publication houses wanted to kind of bring back out from the dead. I think that this book has an excellent creepy atmosphere. It is the type of fairy story that I tend to enjoy, which is a little bit darker, a little bit more atmospheric, and a lot less romantic than the fairy stories that we are given in present times. But I thought that it was really good. It is not as easy to read as modern fantasy because it was written a long time ago and the writing style reflects that, but it's quite short and I think that it does a really good job. It, again, was the easiest choice on this list because it's the only decade wherein I had only read one of the selections that was offered. But I would like to think that even if I had read a bunch of the books that were on the list from 1920 to 1929, that Lud in the Mist probably still would have been the one that I picked because it does appeal to a lot of the things that I like. And as you know, Neil Gaiman is one of my favorite authors, and I could definitely see the points in this novel where he has drawn influences, particularly for books like Stardust or The Ocean at the End of the Lane. So I think it's a very solid choice, and I would love to know what your choice would be for the decade of the 1920s. The 1930s was an incredibly important decade for the development of fantasy as a genre and would have huge implications on what would come in the decades to come. And obviously, I think most people, the most recognizable title from the 1930s would be J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. So The Hobbit was published in 1937, so near the end of the decade. And J.R.R. Tolkien, as many of us know, went on to have such a formative influence on the development of fantasy as a whole. There were indeed fantasy books for many years, many hundreds of years before J.R.R. Tolkien began to pen his fantasy epic, but you cannot deny the influence that he had on the genre. And in terms of works published, his first published novel, The Hobbit, was released during this decade. But that was not the only important work of fantasy that was published in the 1930s. Books that still tend to be really well read now in the present time include T.H. White's The Sword and the Stone. We often read this as the compendium of The Once and Future King, and other short stories in that bind-up did get released at later dates, but The Sword and the Stone was released in 1938. We also had the beginnings of the Conan novelettes by Robert E. Howard. So again, because of the way that publishing works, some of the Conan books you will find were published in later decades because many of them were bound up. But in terms of those novelettes, those short stories that were beginning to be published, Conan did have its development or its birth in the 1930s. So that was a particularly important development for fantasy, but especially for epic fantasy, which is one of my favorite types of fantasy to read. Another name that you'll often see associated with the Conan mythology is L. Sprague de Camp, and he also had an influential work of fantasy called Lest Darkness Falls that was also released in the 1930s. Mary Poppins and The Wizard of Oz continued to be stories for young children that had an influence on the fantasy genre during this decade. So we do see the rise of some of those adventure stories, which still seem to skew a little more towards children. We would probably classify many of these works as middle grade in terms of present marketing. But these were the beginnings of the fantasy genre that we were beginning to see grow and change. And of course, I don't think anybody would ever say that we could classify Conan the Barbarian as children's stories, but that is another important and influential work of fantasy that had its beginnings during this decade. Into the 1930s, this was, again, another choice that was not so difficult because As you know, if you've spent a lot of time on the channel, The Hobbit is one of my nostalgic favorites. This is one of the first fantasy books that was ever read to me. I didn't read it myself, but it was hugely formative in terms of my love of fantasy, the books that I would go on to read, and so it has to be my pick for favorite fantasy book of the decade for the 1930s. I think a lot of people have read The Hobbit, but there is, I think, a fairly large chunk of people who have enjoyed the Lord of the Rings movies or who have gone on to read Lord of the Rings later in their lives who have not read The Hobbit and wonder if they should go back and read it because it is technically a middle grade book. And I think while it is a great book for kids, I loved it as a kid, I have read it to my kids and they both really enjoyed it. I think that it's also a lot of fun to read as an adult. It's difficult for me to separate my nostalgia from the objective qualities of the book. Like, I know that I cannot pick up The Hobbit and read it and give you any semblance of objectivity. I can't even attempt it because it is so woven into the fabric of the fantasy that I love that I would not be able to separate it for a second. However, I do think that it is worth reading. I think it's really fun. It is more of a straightforward sort of adventure tale than the Lord of the Rings. It's very episodic. There's a mini adventure in each chapter, and Bilbo is a delightful character. My kids loved Bilbo Baggins, and I remember loving Bilbo Baggins so much as a kid, to the point where I was really angry when I started the Lord of the Rings because it was not centered around Bilbo. So I think that Bilbo is a very lovable character. I think that you should read The Hobbit. If you haven't read it, it is the clear choice to me for books that were published in the 1930s. And if you have not read The Hobbit, then please take this opportunity to go do so. In the 1940s, fantasy stories continued to gain traction. We had serialized stories that were coming out. There were magazines and anthologies of short works of fantasy fiction that were beginning to gain popularity, if not critical acclaim during this time. J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit did meet to much critical success upon its release. He would not get the same amount of fame that he got from The Lord of the Rings, but the influence of The Hobbit would continue to spread its tendrils throughout the 1940s. Of course, we can't ignore what was happening in the world at the tail end of the 1930s and into the 1940s with World War II. And I think that had a big impact on publishing as a whole, on art as a whole, the way that people decided to write stories, the way that stories were published, and obviously the types of stories that the public was looking for. It's difficult to fully talk about those kinds of topics in one short video, but we can't deny the influence or the impact that these major world events had in terms of the world of publishing. Some major stories that really stand out from this decade would be Fritz Leiber's Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. So this is a series, again, that it doesn't get talked about a lot in terms of modern day booktube, but it is definitely a series that you can continue to see the influence that it had on the genre, and it is a series that still is read and discussed today. It might not get the same amount of airtime as some other fantasy series, but it is certainly one that has not faded away into obscurity. We also had J.R.R. Tolkien going on to publish more works, including his Farmer Giles of Ham. We got the rise of the Moomins, the stories from Sweden. So the very first Moomin story, The Moomins and the Great Flood, was released in the 1940s. And this went on to become a very popular series, and I think popular throughout the world as well. And then, of course, we had Mervyn Peake publishing the very first installment in his Gormenghast series of novels with Titus Groan. Moving along into the 1940s, this is another decade where I did struggle to find a lot of fantasy titles, and I talked about this a little bit in the voiceover about the state of the world in the 1940s. Obviously, priorities were on other things. That's not to say that great books didn't get published, that people didn't have great ideas, but it was more difficult for me to find an absolute range of novels that had been published at this time. Of the selections that I gave, For me, my favorite book that I read of those selections given is Mervyn Peake's Titus Grown. I've talked about this a few times on the channel. I included it in a video of books that people who want to write fantasy should read. I included it on a recommendations video for underrated fantasy. And I really do think that it is a book that is worth reading, but for a particular kind of reader. This is sometimes pitched as gothic fantasy. It is a very atmospheric book, which means for me that the author puts in a lot of effort in terms of building up the setting, of making you feel like you're immersed in the story. And there are a lot of grotesque characters here. You spend your time in Castle Gormenghast, and the titular character, Titus Grown, has just been born, and he's born into this family with all these rituals. And it's a very strange fantasy book. It is very unlike a lot of fantasy that I have read. And unfortunately came out at a time where it was competing with things like The Lord of the Rings, which is a very difficult book to compete with. I know that this came out a decade before The Lord of the Rings was published, but it was still in that era of fantasy where I think it did get a little bit lost in the fray. It does get talked about on BookTube sometimes, but I think if you don't mind a denser writing style and you want to see a story that has very intricate exploration of setting, a very interesting cast of characters, and a story that feels very different from other fantasy books that you have read, then I think that you should give Titus Grown a chance. And for me, it definitely deserves the title of winner for the decade of the 1940s. I think we can make the argument that the 1950s were one of the most influential decades when we're talking about modern fantasy. So again, I just want to stress that there's a lot of fantasy that existed before J.R.R. Tolkien. There's a lot of great fantasy that you can read, that you can go back and discover that influenced Tolkien and the development of his worlds. But we would be remiss if we did not identify 1950 as a pivotal turning point in the history of fantasy due to the publication of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Fellowship of the Ring. As I'm sure many people know, the Lord of the Rings was written as a single volume, but due to economic and publishing constraints, was split into 3 books and published as such. So the first installment of those books, The Fellowship of the Ring, was released in the 1950s. One of the good friends and teammate on the Inklings writing group with J.R.R. Tolkien was his good friend, C.S. Lewis, who also began to publish his Narnia Chronicles in the 1950s. So we got that foundational novel in The Lord of the Rings, that kind of epic fantasy with that huge world building that we hadn't seen at that scale outside of the mythologies or the Eddas. We've got in novelization, we got that huge scale world building for the very first time with The Lord of the Rings, but we went on to get some classic works of children's fantasy as well, including The Chronicles of Narnia, Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. We also got in the 1950s The Dying Earth by Jack Vance. And we also had the rise of the vampire/zombie subgenre with I Am Legend. I know that you can make the argument that that is not pure fantasy, but I think in the 1950s, the genre was still really developing. We did not have those really defined subgenres or really defined categorizations of speculative fiction as we do now. So I think that it's important to acknowledge the huge impact that stories like I Am Legend had on the fantasy and of course the science fiction and the horror that was going to come in the decades to follow. But obviously a huge year, or a huge decade for the development of fantasy as a genre. All right, so everybody knows which book is gonna win for the 1950s. If you have watched my video on my favorite fantasy series of all time, there is no other book that I could select here but The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. So this was released in the latter half of the 1950s, and you don't need me to tell you the influence that The Lord of the Rings has had on fantasy in terms of fantasy media, from books and then later into the development of fantasy movies and the popularity of fantasy as a visual medium. Lord of the Rings just has its paws all over fantasy in all realms, and I think that that is totally deserved. I love these books so much. I think that they are still bringing people joy. I think that they are still very much worth reading, and I just love them. The Lord of the Rings will probably always be my favorite fantasy series, just in terms of nostalgia, in terms of opening me up to the world of fantasy as a whole. It would be very difficult to separate my love from fantasy from the Lord of the Rings. And so the very clear winner for this decade for me is the Fellowship of the Ring. With the publication of The Lord of the Rings at the end of the 1950s, fantasy fiction began to gain a lot of popular traction in the literary world. J.R.R. Tolkien was met with great success upon the publication of The Lord of the Rings, and fantasy did start to garner more mainstream appeal in the 1960s. You saw an increase in publication in the spheres of fantasy, and this is probably also, if you are interested in those types of things, where we started to see a lot of what we would call in the present time young adult or YA fiction coming to the forefront. I don't think in the 1960s the authors who were writing these books necessarily thought of them as YA fiction. They probably thought of them more as coming of age stories or stories with young protagonists. But we did get some of our most enduring works of young adult fiction, those books that we think of as classics in that subgenre. We started to get those in the 1960s. Some really huge titles being released during this decade. So this was obviously the beginning of the Earthsea saga by Ursula K. Le Guin. We had A Wrinkle in Time, which was published by Madeleine L'Engle, and this is probably it toes the boundary between fantasy and science fiction. These books do have elements of space travel or time travel, but they deal with a lot of fantastical creatures. They deal with a lot of fantasy tropes. So I would argue that this is a series of books that definitely straddles that line between science fiction and fantasy. And I think that Madeleine L'Engle's work did have a big influence on the development of fantasy fiction and of young adult fantasy fiction in particular. So I think that it is important to include it in this list. We also had Peter S. Beagle's The Last Unicorn, and then Ray Bradbury's Something Wicked This Way Comes, which gives us the beginning of that kind of dark carnival type fantasy story. Continuing with another important work of young adult fantasy, we had The Phantom Tollbooth that was released in the 1960s. And we also had, if we want to look at some more literary fiction, this was the decade where the 100 Years of Solitude, which is probably one of the best known works of magical realism and continues to be one of the best known and most studied works of magical realism. So even though Marquez did not go on to win his Nobel Prize for another couple of decades, 100 Years of Solitude was originally published in the 1960s. We also had installments in the Elric saga in the 1960s, which were an important turning point for the types of characters that were being written in fantasy. This was also when the initial Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser stories by Fritz Leiber, who we talked about a little bit in the 1940s, this is when those longer novelizations began to be published. So the 1960s, obviously a huge decade for the continued development and the increasing popularity of fantasy as a whole. The 1960s. So this is where my choice is going to get a little bit controversial, because the book that I have selected is one that I think people can make the argument is not truly fantasy, and that is Madeleine L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time. So I don't think I've talked about this series at all on the channel before, which is funny because it is one of my favorite book series of all time. But I haven't done a lot of talking about middle grade or young adult works of fantasy, science fiction on the channel. But Madeleine L'Engle is an author whose works I love. Her book, The Wrinkle in Time, I believe won the Newbery Medal, but I'm not sure. It has won awards. It is a very critically acclaimed novel. Had a huge influence on the young adult genre. It did a lot of really innovative things for the time, and is a book that does not talk down to kids. So this is probably the first book that I ever read as a kid where I felt like the author was pushing me to understand things. I read it probably when I was like 6 or 7, and it felt very different from other books for children that I had read at the time. Even books like The Hobbit or Watership Down, which I enjoy more, which I love more, they're my favorite books. I don't feel like they pushed me in the same way that The Wrinkle in Time did and the other books in that series. They discuss philosophical themes. There's a lot about family dynamics, a lot about our role within the universe and the environment. And there were a lot of great books that came out in the 1960s. This was not necessarily an easy choice for me to make, but I think that it counts because I would classify this as science fantasy. I think a lot of the characters, a lot of the tropes, a lot of the setup feels very much like fantasy, even though there is a space setting, which I know a lot of people would say automatically kind of qualifies it as science fiction. But I'm going to select it anyway. And if you have not read this series for kids, if you have any interest in middle grade books at all, if you have kids that you want to read books to, I cannot recommend this series highly enough. I love it so, so much. And I will unabashedly make it my selection for the winner of my favorite fantasy book that was published in the 1960s. All right, so that ends the first part of the video. I don't know what kind of optimistic planet I was living on when I thought that I could do this whole thing in less than 30 minutes. So we are going to cut that off halfway, and I will return with the second part of this video in a couple of days' time, overviewing the prominent works of fantasy fiction and my selections for favorite books of each decade from the 1970s through to 2019. I had a lot of fun putting together the first half of this video, so if anybody has any big suggestions for things that I have forgotten, since I have even finished recording this, I have thought of a couple of things like the advent of the superhero comic and some other things that I didn't fit into the video. But if you think that there are any particular selections that I left out, I would love to hear them. And of course, I would love to hear what your personal choices are for best fantasy book of each of the decades that I have covered. But hopefully you enjoyed it, and I will see you back for the probably more difficult choices because these are going to be the more modern fantasy books in a couple of days. Bye!